Hello there and welcome to another Hero Arts video. It's Michelle Short here, and today I'm hot foiling and pressing the new Thinking of You plate to see which look I like best. So let's get started. This is the Love and Thinking of You BetterPress and hot foil plates, and in the set you get the Thinking of You sentiment, a word that says love, and then also a flourish, and I'm using the Thinking of You today. So I'm going to start off with my hot foiled panel. I like to hot foil in a maybe slightly different way than a lot of people do. I like to create a little bit of a sandwich. So I've got a panel of deluxe smooth white cardstock, and now I'm cutting my Glimmer hot foil to size. This is the silver colour. So I have my plate on top of the foil, and then both of those are on top of my cardstock piece. My cardstock piece is a lot bigger than I actually need it to be. I want it to have a finished size of an A2 panel, but because this sentiment is kind of like a little bit of a flourishy one, I do sometimes find it a little bit difficult to see if I'm placing it down straight onto my panel. So I like to work with a slightly larger panel, and then I can cut it down and make sure that it's as straight as possible. So I'm holding my sandwich down with some Best Ever craft tape, and I have found in the past with this plate that I don't get a great foiling impression right in the center of this plate. Now this is purely just because of my machines. I obviously don't have enough pressure where this part of the sentiment is. The outsides foil perfectly, but the inside doesn't. So I'm using some layers of this Best Ever craft tape to kind of build up a little bit of a shim in that center, and that does tend to work quite well for me. You can do this in lots of different ways, but I do find that that tape does work quite nicely. It does look like I'm wasting quite a lot of it, but I do reuse this tape. For the purposes of the video, I was using new pieces, but I do tend to reuse this tape quite a lot. So I have placed my sandwich with the plate side down onto my Glimmer hot foil system. I have pressed the timer button to heat up that platform. And because these plates are the ones that can be used for pressing and hot foiling, I find that with my machines I do like to heat them up twice. So I removed that platform, pushed it back in, and then pressed the timer button for a second time. This just works for me. What I have found, especially with hot foiling and also pressing, is that you want to find a method that works for you and stick to it. I will show you a little bit later my pressing. I kind of changed my method and it didn't really work. So definitely find a way that works for you and keep to it. So I have removed that platform from the base, and now I can run that through my Platinum 6 die cutting machine. I like to add the platform back into the base so that it can heat up again if I need to use it for a second time. So this plate is quite hot at this point, so I want to be careful. This tape does tend to remove really quite nicely from cardstock, especially because it's kind of warm at this point, so it does tend to remove quite nicely, but I'm just being careful here not to rip that cardstock. So that is my foiling all done, and it's looking really pretty. So now I'm going to work on my pressed piece. So this is where I kind of switched from my norm and decided that I wanted to add a little bit of plastic onto the chase, which is that grey metal kind of platform piece there, or the piece that's in the platform I should say. And the reason for this is so that when you add the ink onto your plate, it goes onto the plastic. This is a piece of packaging, stamp packaging, and so you can just clean that off really easily rather than scrubbing it a little bit onto that chase, which I do find the ink does take a little while to kind of get off. So I've kind of placed that down, stuck it down with some more Best Ever craft tape, and now I've got my plate, and this time I'm going to go for a landscape card. For my foiling I went with a portrait card, so I thought I would do something a little bit different for this one. So I have placed my plate down onto the chase there, and that's going to hold in place because the chase is magnetic. I've then got my platen, and I can add some porcelain card panel onto that, and again I'm going for a larger size than I need to, so this is an A7 panel. I can then ink up my plate using BetterPress black ink. And this is where you can see that as you add the ink onto it, it does tend to go around the outside edges. I haven't necessarily found a way to get around that. It just does tend to do that. So as I'm pressing that ink pad down, I'm kind of pressing it down and then pivoting it a little bit to get really nice coverage of that ink. I did realise at this point that I wanted to remove one of the shims that's underneath that chase. The system comes with 3 shims, but with these kind of more intricate sentiments, I do find that I like to just use the 1 shim rather than the 2 shims, which I usually use all of the time. I pretty much never use 3 shims for my machines. That again is just what works best for me. So I have placed the platen onto the platform and then I'm running that through my die cutting machine. And as I lift the platen off of this platform, you can see that on the cardstock I've got some ink transfer from where it's on that plastic, and I'm really upset about this because I don't know what I did wrong. I see lots of people do this and it works absolutely fine for them. So if this is a method that you do, please tell me what I did wrong. I decided to remove that plastic and I'm just going to work straight onto that chase, and second time around it worked really nicely. So I'm just running that through for the second time. I can remove the platen. And now I've got a really nice impression of that sentiment. I now want to work on the flowers that I'm going to add onto my cards. So this is the Spring Garden February 2025 Fancy Dies of the Month kit. I absolutely love these flowers and I didn't get a chance to use them when they were released, so I'm really glad that I can now. I thought that they would work really nicely with the sentiments. So I'm going to cut these from some cardstock. So I'm starting off with the crocus here, and actually at this point I didn't realise this was a crocus. If I had, I probably would have cut it from purple cardstock rather than aqua cardstock, but I'd already done the hyacinths in purples, and so I could have done them in blues, but never mind. So this is the crocus, and for the base layer I'm using Paradise cardstock, and for the top layer I'm using Mist cardstock. For these tulips, I am cutting the base layer from Ultra Pink and then the top layer from Peony. And then for these hyacinths, I'm using the Passion Flower, which is the lightest shade, and then also the amethyst. Excuse me, I completely forgot what colour it was. The amethyst is the darker colour. And then for the daffodil I'm using Canary cardstock, and then for the centre I'm using beeswax cardstock. And then for the stems and the leaves I'm using the Spellbinders colour wheel cardstock, and this is the peridot colour, and then I'm also cutting them from the rainforest colour as well. So I am going to run these through twice, and actually I do cut these a few different times so that I've got enough flowers for both of the cards. So I can place them down onto my cutting plates and run those through my die cutting machine. I can now adhere the pieces together, and these are really easy because the flowers just have 2 layers to them. So I can use a little bit of liquid glue here and just place the top layer of that tulip onto the base layer. And then I can do the same thing for the crocus as well. And I like to use liquid glue here just so that it gives me a little bit of wiggle room to try and line them up as best as possible. My glues are a little bit on the wet side, and so I'm kind of dabbing off the excess glue onto my scrap piece of cardstock here, and then I can layer those up, and it just helps to not have so much kind of glue seeping out the sides. And then I can do the daffodil here as well. You can layer up the hyacinth pieces, but you can also keep them separate, which is what I've done today. So I've got my foiled panel here, And I want to cut this down into an A2 size panel. So that's a size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. And I have a template here that I add into my MISTI if I want to stamp something and make sure that it's straight. So I'm using this as a guide so that I can figure out the size of where I want to cut this panel down. And I'm bringing in my flowers here so that I can make sure that I've got enough space below that sentiment to add in all of these flowers. I don't want it kind of too high up on the panel. I want it to try and nest in a little bit with these flowers. So once I'm happy with that placement, I can then draw a faint pencil line just around the outside edges so that I know where I want to cut this down. And like I said, this is a really great way that if you haven't lined these pieces, or the sentiments I should say, up perfectly, you can kind of got that wiggle room. And especially on this one here, the pressed one, I don't think it was perfectly straight. Although I will say that in my finished card for the foiled one, I'm not sure it's perfectly straight, unfortunately. I should have taken a little bit more time to try and line that up, but it's not too bad. So this piece here, kind of like the first cut, is the only one you need to kind of worry about to try and line up. Once you've lined that one up and got that straight, then you can use the guillotine kind of as intended and push that up to the other side, and then the other pieces will be straight. So that's those panels cut down. I want to add a little bit of ink blending at the bottom of these panels, so I'm temporarily adhering them onto some scrap paper just to hold them in place while I do my ink blending on top. So I'm starting off with Kiwi Core ink and a large ink blending brush, and I'm just going to add a little bit of this ink towards the bottom of the panel. This is where the flowers are going to be, and I kind of wanted it to look a little bit like that there was kind of more foliage in the background, but kind of a little bit blurred out, if that makes sense. So it kind of just makes it look a little bit more full than it actually will end up being. So I used that large brush and kind of faded that out towards the top of that ink blending. And now I can go in with Green Hills Core ink, and I can add that towards the bottom. So just really very kind of towards the bottom here. I'm not bringing this colour up that far, but it is just going to darken it up a little bit. So that's why I'm using the smaller brush there. And then I can do the same thing for the other panel. So that Kiwi Core ink towards the bottom. And like I said, I do bring this up a little bit further than I do with the darker colour. And for that, that's why I do like to use the larger brush. I do find that I get a slightly lighter blend that way. And then I can go in with the Green Hills and add a little bit of that towards the bottom. And I do think that I add a little bit more of the darker colour on this panel. And actually I really like how it turned out. So I wish that I had added a little bit more onto the foiled one. I'm now just going back in with that lighter brush and just making sure that that's really nice and blended. And then I can lift that off from the scrap paper and then just remove that adhesive with my finger. It does come off really nicely. And then I can add some tape runner adhesive onto the back of these panels and then adhere them down onto A2 size white card bases. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. So I'm just going to try and line these up as best as possible. And then once I'm happy, I can bring in my bone folder, and I like to just press down the edges, make sure that everything's really well stuck down. So now my card bases are ready to add the flowers on top, and I have switched to a glue that has got a finer tip onto it. I think it was just a little bit easier for these tiny little stems. So I'm adding the hyacinths onto the stems first, just adding a little bit of liquid glue down the centre and then I can adhere them down onto the stems. And I'm trying to mix up the different greens that I've used for the stems and the leaves for the different flowers, just so that it gives a little bit more of a variety. I could have added some ink blending onto these pieces, and I do think that that would look really nice, but I felt that for these cards I just wanted to keep them the cardstock as is, but it would add a little bit more depth with the ink blending. So I'm trying to sort of figure out here where I want everything to be placed, and I'm kind of going through and sort of doing it maybe sort of a little bit like flower by flower, or kind of 2 flowers at a time. So I feel like I quite like that daffodil there on the right hand side, and I wanted the hyacinth to be a little bit taller so it kind of nestles in a little bit better with that bottom of the sentiment. I know some people like to arrange everything and then maybe use a little bit of like press and seal or something to pick everything up, and then you can adhere everything at the same time. And I do always think that that is a great idea, but then I do tend to just find that I just do things sort of one by one, and that tends to usually work for me as well. It may just take a little bit longer though. So I'm being careful here not to adhere the stems down completely, because I do want to add some of the leaves behind the stems. Some of them I'm adding them on top, and some of them I'm adding underneath. But because I'm using that liquid glue, I've got time to sort of wiggle things in place. And then for the flower heads, I'm adding a little bit of thin foam tape onto those. I am going to overlap some of these flowers, or either side I should say, the crocus and the daffodil, over the edge of the card base. This does sometimes mean that it can't fit in a standard sized envelope, but I do often like to do this with these kind of designs because it makes it look a little bit more like the kind of picture that you're looking at kind of extends over the outside of the card. I hope that kind of makes sense. So that's why I quite like doing it, but I know that that's not for everyone, and you could absolutely just either cut the sides off, or you could just make sure that they're further in to the card and they won't overlap the edges. It's definitely just personal preference. So I'm just going through here adding in these flowers and stems. And you can see that adding that little bit of ink blending just kind of brings it all together a little bit, and makes it look a little bit fuller than it actually is. I could have added loads more flowers here. There are gaps obviously in between the flowers. I quite like that look. I quite like clean and simple cards, but you could definitely go all out here and add lots more if you wanted to. So this one here, I'm kind of adding one of the leaves behind the stem and one on top of the stem, and then I'm just kind of figuring out here where I want these tulips to be. And I tend to sort of change my mind a little bit as I'm going, but that's quite a good way of kind of seeing where you want something to end up, and then you can stick something down once you're happy with it. It is a little bit more difficult, especially using liquid glue, to kind of lift things off. Sometimes that glue, although you've got time to sort of wiggle things in place, it does, especially if you've got ink blending underneath, might kind of lift up some of that ink blending. So I'm just trying to be a little bit careful here. Again, adding some thin foam tape onto the back of the tulip heads here. And then I can pop those in place. And I just wanted to overlap some of the flowers together, make it look a little bit more natural. So just making sure that those leaves and stems, excuse me, are really well stuck down at the bottom. And then I couldn't figure out here which side I wanted this leaf to be. I wish that I had added it on the left side rather than the right side, which I do add it on, but never mind. So just making sure that those are all well stuck down at the bottom, and then I can flip the card over and cut all of those pieces off from the bottom. Just using my scissors there. So that's all of the flowers done for the first card, and then off camera I did do them for this card here as well. I didn't want to bore you with adding them all on, but I do think that this kind of composition I think worked a little bit better than the portrait one. I think the flowers kind of nestle in quite nicely with the sentiment in this landscape format. So I think if I was to make this card again, I would definitely make them both landscape rather than one portrait and one landscape. But it's quite nice just to have the difference between them. So I'm finishing off by embellishing with some clear enamel dots. I didn't want anything to really kind of detract from the cards. I wanted something quite sort of light and airy. And my go-to for this is clear enamel dots because it adds a little bit extra onto a card, but you haven't really got sort of too much, like I say, to distract from the images or anything like that. And because they're completely clear, you can see through them as well, which is always nice. Just figuring out where to add this last one here. And I decide to kind of pop it underneath one of the leaves, which is why I quite like to not have everything stuck down really perfectly. It's quite nice to add embellishments kind of poking out from different places. So I can finish off by adding some more of these clear enamel dots onto the foiled card as well. And I did kind of feel like this card was a little bit more pale, and I probably could have added some kind of more colourful embellishments, but I decided to kind of keep them fairly similar so that you could kind of see the difference between the pressing of the plate and the foiling of the plate. So I'm just going to finish off with one last embellishment here towards that sentiment. So do let me know in the comments which you prefer. Rather you prefer the hot foiled one, which is this one here, or the pressed one. I do think this one edges it slightly for me. Like I say, I think the layout of the card and the design is a little bit better. But I do really love the elegance of the hot foiling as well. So I kind of like a little bit of both. So let me know in the comments which is your favourite. Links to the supplies that I used will be over on the Hero Arts blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.